back here again in this virtual community and with the Young Israel Tina community. I also want to thank the sponsors and both Daniel and Shlomo for their help in setting this up. Just a word about this evening's lecture. We're going to structure it slightly differently than last week in that I'm going to suggest that any questions that you have as we're going along, it's hard for me to see the chat when they come up. So I'm going to suggest that you put the questions into the chat, and then at the end, we'll scroll through all of the questions that came up along the way, and I will do my best to answer them all. Okay, so last week we started what is a three-part series that is here to tell the story of the making of modern Judaism. That is Judaism as we know it today. And we broke this up into three parts. We said last time that we couldn't possibly tell this story completely in three one-hour sessions together, but that we would do our best. And we devoted last week to the rise of the Reform movements. And I believe if you missed last week, it was recorded, and I'm sure the Young Israel can provide that link to you. Today's lecture is going to make reference to last week's, but God willing, will stand on its own as well. During the interwar period between World War I and World War II, a community organization in Warsaw printed the following Rosh Hashanah greeting card, where with a caption on the bottom that says in Yiddish, Deutsch zi chassid, reich zi arem, reicht eich bridelach die hand, lishana toiva tichatevu, their ears end, und them ears end. So German or chassid, rich or poor, shake a brotherly hand. May you be inscribed for a good year, no matter who or how you are. So by the time we get to the middle of, or the beginning of the 20th century in the interwar period, we already have a clear sense that there is a schism within the Jewish people. And while this Rosh Hashanah greeting card may actually be an inspiring call for what we might call interdenominational unity, it at the same time recognizes that there are two very different worlds at play in the Jewish community by this time. The YIVO Institute is I believe, the world's largest collection, certainly of Yiddish literature, but also one of the most important collections of Eastern European literature of any sort. And in YIVO's exhibit, in which they placed this greeting card, you can see that they translated the word Deutsch, or German, as Reform Jew. That is, Germany by this point had become synonymous with Reform Judaism. And so while there was a call here for the two to shake hands, it was also clear that we have in this postcard before us two almost opposing sides. The Reformed Jew on the left, with his modern clothing, his outer coat, which doesn't reach all the way down, his polished shoes, his bowler hat, seemingly a briefcase under his arm, and you can see the beautiful synagogue, which is behind him, and the chassid on the right, who seems to be looking down at him quite literally and figuratively. His coat reaches the floor. You can see his white stockings on the bottom, seemingly holding a talus in his hand, and a rather nondescript building, perhaps a shul or yeshiva, behind him. Two different worlds, a call for them to unite in this greeting card, but also a recognition that they are, in fact, at this point, quite far from one another. And so while we told the story of the rise of Reform Judaism last time, our goal today is to tell the story of that group which came about in opposition to Reform Judaism. Why here it's referred to as a chassid is something we will describe later on in tonight's lecture. Clearly the story of Chasidus, the rift between Misnagdim and Hasidim, is not our story for tonight. Invite me back for another time and we'll tell that story. But the story really is the story of the origins of Ultra-Orthodoxy. Now, I once gave this lecture many years ago, and somebody in the crowd said to me, well, what do you mean origins of Ultra-Orthodoxy? Weren't we always ultra-Orthodox? wasn't reform, the new innovation in Judaism, and the ultra-Orthodox simply kept doing what Jews always did? And the answer to that question is a definitive no. Ultra-Orthodoxy is not the same thing as what we had always been. The great historian Jacob Katz differentiates between traditional Judaism and traditionalist Judaism. That is, with the emergence of an other forces those around them to define themselves in terms of the other. And it forces innovation, as we will see, even in traditional circles, as they begin to contend with the challenges that begin to be posed by those who are not the same as them. And that's our story for this evening. So we said last time that the crux of our story, the cauldron, as it were, from which modern Judaism is born, is this period from 1818 to 1885 in Western Europe, Western and Central Europe. And the timeline that you have on the left-hand side of your screen, one that we showed last time, is there for the purposes of demonstrating that the three stories that we're telling over the course of this series, the story of the rise of reform, indicated by the green boxes on your left, the story of the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy, indicated by the red boxes on the timeline on your left, and the rise of neo-Orthodoxy, reflected in the blue boxes, are really intertangled. I'm going to tell them, right, each story individually, but chronologically speaking, they're all happening at the same time, responding to one another, forcing the other into particular positions that will come to define each of these sub-denominations. We started last time in telling the story of Western Europe and the rise of reform as an outgrowth of the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment being the 16th and the 17th century, sorry, the 17th and the 18th centuries in Western Europe. And we described how that period of time in Western Europe brings about a sense that things are new, capped off by the French Revolution. And by the time we get to the late 18th century, the early 19th century, there's a sense that Western Europe is an enlightened place, dramatically different than anything that Eastern Europe had ever seen. And we noted that from there begins to come this push towards what we called aesthetic reforms, desire for Jews to feel like their religion was keeping up with the times from an aesthetic perspective, from the way that it looked, from the way that it sounded. And we begin to see small shuls crop up in various places that begin to pay more attention to the aesthetics of their davening, to their service, to the way in which the rabbis are dressing, to the way in which the tefillos sounded. And we noted then that there was a crucial period in the first decade of the 19th century in which Napoleon starts off here in the Kingdom of France, right, and works his way, conquers this entire area, either conquers it or allies himself with these various German states, all the way on his way through what was Poland and into the Russian Empire. Right? And as he does that, he brings many of the ideas of enlightened France together with him, bringing, at least for a brief moment, to many of these places, full-fledged emancipation to the Jewish communities of these areas. And then by 1812, we noted that he is defeated, forced all the way back to France, and with it are dashed the hopes of many of the Jews living in these German states. What rises in the wake of Napoleon is a very nationalistic sense amongst these smaller states, and a desire, not necessarily, although enlightened, not necessarily to follow in the footsteps of Napoleon. And so we have Jewish communities, particularly in these areas, these smaller states that are of German culture, if not yet fully German by nationality. It's in these areas in which we begin to see a push within these early reformers to take things even one step further. And we noted that in these communities, there were really two things that were driving these early reform communities. One was a sense as I mentioned a moment ago, that the tefillos, the service in the shuls of their day simply weren't speaking to people to post-enlightened, post-French Revolution, post-Enlightenment Jews of the West. So there was a desire to connect, and particularly for the young people to connect. And there was also a growing feeling, particularly in these areas, that if they, the Jews of Western Europe, were ever to receive, to ever get full citizenship in these German lands, they would have to take certain steps to make themselves worthy of that kind of emancipation and citizenship, steps that often involve certain changes in their religious practice. And so we saw, sorry, one second. We saw that much of this comes to a head. In 1817, when a group in Hamburg decided that they too want to have a reformed, aesthetically reformed shul, similar to the ones that had been built in other smaller German towns and in Berlin. But this group in Hamburg decided to take things one step further. So you see here in their constitution of the Hamburg Temple, right, that was driving them, at least in print, what was driving them was the necessity to restore public worship to its deserving dignity. You can see further down that they desired a dignified and well-ordered ritual, a sense that the Ashkenazic davening in particular that had come over from Eastern Europe didn't have that sense of dignity. It didn't have that sense of ritual or the aesthetic inspiration that one could find, particularly in Protestant Christianity, which surrounded them. And so that's what they were out to do. However, the Hamburg Temple, we noted, took things one step further in certain particular areas. Most notable amongst them was a desire to eliminate, although it was not it wasn't the most cohesive or consistent of editing jobs, a desire to take out references from their siddur to a return to Israel. This, after all, was felt to be one of the roadblocks that was preventing German Jewry from being fully accepted by their neighbors. And again, accepted here, we don't just mean in a social sense. We mean in a legal sense. Jews did not have, despite all the enlightenment, right, of German society at that time, Jews did not have full rights as citizens. And it was felt that much of what was holding them back was the fact that Jews 3 times a day would stand up and say, would say, God, take me back to Israel. Get me out of here. I don't want to be in Germany. I don't want to be in Prussia. I don't want to be in Berlin or in Hamburg. And so the feeling was we had to change that. If we were ever going to be fully emancipated and fully get the rights which we deserve, there were certain things we were going to have to do as well. So one of the things that they did was that they put out a new siddur, which included some changes to the liturgy itself. Number 2, they introduced tefillos that would be said in German. That is, they translated some of them and said that as part of our official davening, we're going to say some of these tefillos in German. And number 3, they brought an organ into the shul, which of course was going to be played by a non-Jew, not by a Jew. Now, I mentioned last time that this paragraph on the right comes from the Musaf Shemona Esrei, and we spoke about how the changes that were made were specifically changes that took out references to coming back to Zion. Here you can see it. I spelled it out for you just a little bit more. All of the highlighted phrases here were taken out of the Hamburg version of this tefillah. So you can see the first thing they took out was any references to la'alot, l're'ot, l'shtachavot, l'panecha, to go up and to appear before Hashem, meaning to appear in Yerushalayim, in Israel. That wasn't going to pass muster in 19th century Germany. And here again in the next paragraph, you see on the right-hand side, it says, Yehi ratzon milofanecha Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu, shetekabel b'rachamim uv'ratzon, areshes sefaseinu b'mkom korbanos chavoseinu. We too say, Yehi ratzon milofanecha Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu. So far, so good. Right? But then we say, Melech Rachaman, shetashu v'serachem We talk about the building of our Beis Hamikdash. Rebuild it, right? Bring yourself back there. And then the famous line from the Musaf, the Musaf Shmona Esrei, the Karev Pizurenu mi ben hagoyim unefutzosenu kanes miarkis hayaretz. Bring in an ingathering of the exiles from the four corners of the world. Well, certainly the Jews of Hamburg were not comfortable saying that anymore, felt like those were the types of things that were preventing them from getting the emancipation that they so desired. Now, it is important to note that even here in 1817, with the creation of the Hamburg Temple, anything that these new or early Reformed communities were doing, they were doing with some degree of halachic approbation. They were always seeking, right, at this point in the development of the Reform movement, they were always seeking some halachic guidance that would give the okay for what it was that they were doing. And here in with the Hamburg Temple controversy in the 1870s and 1818, this legitimacy was given through a series of tshuvot that were written, and then a compilation that was then written in response to some of the backlash that ensued, called Or Noga, written by a man named Rabbi Eliezer Lieberman. And you can see this was written in 1818. So the Hamburg Temple Association creates their constitution, declares what it is they intend to do in 1817. They have some rabbinic backing behind it. There is some backlash to it. The rabbinic backing now gets together and puts out this piece called Org Noga. And you can see here on the left-hand side that 3 pages into this text is this little note that says, Ve'ila divrei hashir asher shalach li yedid libi harav hagaon hamufla, and Aaron Chorener, that is the next underlined name. Av Bezdin de Kilhas Kodesh Arad. Nishluchi elav et hasefer. Bishalchi elav et hasefer hazeh. Be'ezras Hashem. So, what he is now printing here is a poem, which somebody by the name of Aaron Chorener, who is the Av Bezdin of the city of Arad in Hungary. This Av Bezdin, Aaron Chorener, or Aaron Chorin, as his anglicized name, sent him a poem extolling the virtues of this particular work called Or Noga that Eliezer Lieberman had written. And we're going to come back to Eila Divrei Hashir and Aaron Chorener in just a moment. But just so that you can get a sense for what is in this book, there's Aaron Chorener, or Aaron Chorin. Again, an Orthodox rabbi by any stretch of our imagination. Certainly there wasn't anything other than an Orthodox rabbi, right, at this point in our history. But here, a few pages into this text, you can see that Eliezer Lieberman goes Tana by Tana, claim by claim, that it was made against these early Reformed Jews in the Hamburg Temple, each one listing, this was the backlash that we received. He goes through, it's 8 of them, right? And then he's going to begin ta'ana by ta'ana, claim by claim, showing why there is halachic backing for the moves that the Hamburg Temple was making. Now, this presents a particularly significant challenge to the Beis Din in Hamburg, because this wasn't just a grassroots kind of movement amongst people who wanted shuls that looked nicer, or that sounded nicer, or were slightly more orderly. There were changes that were being made to the siddur. There were changes that were being made to the way in which the davening happened, and not only that, but they were being backed by people who were claiming halachic authority, who were citing halachic texts to back what it was they were going to do. And therefore, the Hamburg Beis Din felt like they needed additional firepower to deal with this particular challenge. And so they sent out a letter to the Gedolim of Western and Central Europe during this time. So out to Prussia, to Austria, even down into Italy, describing what was happening here in Hamburg and describing it as an existential threat to Judaism. because here were people who were making changes to the way things have always been done in our liturgy, in our shuls, and they were doing so, in their opinion, under the guise of halachic validity. And so they were asked these luminaries of the halachic world to please pen letters and send them to them, showing why it was that this shul and the changes that they were looking to make were not acceptable by halachic standards. Now, these texts were then collected, right, and placed into a compilation, a printed text called Eile Divrei Habris. Now, if you recall, right, the beginning of Or Noga quoted the poem of Aaron Choriner, which started Eile Divrei Hashir of Rabbi Chorin. These were the words of the poetry of Rabbi Chorin. Well, they responded with Eile Divrei Habris. Well, these are the words of the bris, the covenant. This is what actually has to happen, says the Beis Din of Hamburg. As you can see on the bottom here, right, it says B'pkudas Beis Din Tzedek Tekilas Kodesh Hamburg. Right, this was printed by order of the Beis Din of Hamburg, and this is the cover page of the document. And you can see that there are three central claims to the letters which are going to be found, the tshuvos that are going to be found in this compilation. Number one, Asur Lishano Seder HaTfilah HaNehuga BiYisrael Mi Birchos HaShachar Ad Achar Aleinu L'Shtabeach Mikol Shekein She'ein Ligra Mimenu. That it is asur, it is forbidden to change the customary prayers from the Birchos HaShachar in the morning, right, until after Aleinu, and it's certainly asur, certainly prohibited to take anything away from the customary tfilos that we've always done. Number two, asur lihispalel seder hatfila halaz belashon acher chutz milashon hakodesh. It is asur, it is forbidden to say the tefillah in any language other than lashon hakodesh. The chol tefillah hadid peses shelo ketikuna v'shelo b'minhagenu hi psula v'asur lihispalel mitocha. And any tefillah, like the Musaf Shmona Esrei that we saw just a few moments ago, that's printed in a way other than the way we've always printed it, is forbidden. It's forbidden to daven from such a siddur. Asur l'nagem b'beis hakneses b'shum kli shir b'shabbos u'b'yom tov afil al yidei eno Yisrael. And it is forbidden for any musical instrument to be played in a shul on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even by a non-Jew. Now, it would seem, right, it may at first blush, right, seem like this should be relatively easy, and perhaps, right, it's unclear, right, as to why it is that they had to go to such great lengths to ask all the Gedolim of the generation to come and participate, all the Gedolim, I should say, of Western and Central Europe, to participate in this endeavor. But when we take a closer look at these three things, we might begin to see that it's actually not so clear, right? That or perhaps not so easy to defend the positions that are put forth in these three statements. After all, we said that there was already actually two works. I showed you Or Noga. There was another one called Noga HaTzedek, works that brought quite a bit of halachic material in defense of what the Hamburg Temple Association was doing. And certainly of these three, the hardest one, the hardest position here in Eile Divrei Habris to defend would be number two, right? Some of you might know that number two, I can actually is actually explicitly allowed. It's a Mishnah in Masechah Sota, which specifically says that certain things can be said in any language. Amongst them is tefillah. Davening can be said in any language, according to the Mishnah. And the Gemara then further defines and says that's true b'tzibor, right? B'yachid, that's an individual davening on its own, right? Has to daven in Hebrew. But but at Sibor, a congregation that's davening together, you can daven in any language. That's recorded in the Shulchan Aruch. That's been the halacha for hundreds of years. In fact, we know that a part of our tefillah bit Sibor includes paragraphs that are not in Hebrew, right? They're in Aramaic, which was the vernacular at a certain time in our history. And so to take a position that says it is prohibited, it is asur, to do something which the Mishnah and the Shulchan Aruch and hundreds of years of poskim have always said that it was actually mutter to do, was not an easy task at all. And so as we flip our way through this work, Eila Divrei Habris, what we begin to see is certain language that begins to recur over and over again, which will become a hallmark of what we will call ultra-Orthodoxy down to this day. Right? And it is a sense that rather than argue this issue on the finer kind of halachic nuances, there's a bigger issue at stake here. And that bigger issue is there in the red line, first underlined red line on your right-hand side, Minhagan Shel Yisrael Torahi. Our minhagim, our customs are Torah. They are. The way we've done things, that is a legitimate source for Torah. And therefore, it can't be changed. So therefore, right, the next underlined line on the right-hand side, Gam ein nachon ve'asur lihispalel b'lashon acher, rak b'lashon hakodesh. Right? The next underlined line, V'chein asur lishanos shum minhag kavua. We don't change our established minhagim. We can't. We don't. Again, for most people, and this tshuva comes from Rav Gedalia Tiktin, who was the rabbi. It was from Rav Gedalia Tiktin, and then here below you have from Eliezer of Trites, and you can see similar types of language. Right? You also begin to see, right, that that in order to make their point here, you begin to see language that is quite strong, right? Maybe perhaps even extreme in its tone and in its tenor. So here on the top, you can see a direct attack aimed at Rabbi Aaron Chorin, who was the halachic authority behind much of what the Hamburg Temple was trying to do. And they take an ad hominem shot at him and said, "Listen, we know him, right? And he knows nothing. He doesn't know. He doesn't have enough Torah. You know, the Torah that he has could fit in our pinky, right? But more so, they begin to refer to what is happening here, right? As you can see on the right hand side, the second underlined line, using language like kofrim, right? Kofrim biikare hadas vehaemuna. These were people who were heretics, who are aiming at the foundations of our religion. And again, it was necessary in order to make the point, right, that even if you could find halachic basis for some of the things that were being argued, there was a bigger picture here. There was a bigger danger that these poskim saw in what was happening here. And I think it's important at this point to pause for a second, right, and to note that when we study these types of things in history, we have to be really careful not to see them from our perspective in 2020, you know, and using the hindsight that we've been blessed with. To say it differently, the authors of Eila Divrei Habris, they've never been to Teaneck. They've never been to Teaneck. They had no way of knowing that anything other than the complete demise of Judaism would result from these kinds of changes, these kinds of embracing of society and culture around them. They felt like, right, they had already seen, right, the move from a focus just on aesthetics to now a focus on actually changing our liturgy, to bringing in an organ that, it was going to be played by a non-Jew, but who's ever seen an organ in a shul before on Shabbos, right? And so their sense was that this was going to lead right out of Judaism completely, and therefore it had to be stopped in its tracks, even if there was there could be found halachic legitimacy for some, at least, of what they were doing. Um, Here, and this was what I was referring to before from Rav Gedalia Tiktin of Breslau, right, you can see that there's also language here not only referring to them as apikorsim or as kofrim, but you can begin to see language of battle, right? And if you read it, right, on the in the Hebrew, right, he's calling achai, he's calling it's a battle cry to the Jewish people. Right, to gird yourselves, to take up this fight on behalf of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? To be ozer chayil, lilchom milchemes Hashem tzvakos. Right? This is an existential fight that we now need to pick up our swords, right, and fight for the survival of Judaism, because that's exactly how they saw it. Now, in this compilation called Eila Divrei Habris, perhaps the most famous or the participant who will from here on become the most outspoken member of this community or voice for this opposition community would be Rabbi Moshe Sofer. As you can see here, Av Beis Din de Kehilas Kodesh, Pressburg. So Moshe Sofer, otherwise known by his Sefer, Chassam Sofer, writes one of the longest tshuvos found in Eila Divrei Habris. And from this point forward, from 1819 until his death in 1839, so for the next 20 years, it is Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, who will be turned to time and time again to become the voice, the mouthpiece for those who are opposing the reform movement. And therefore, it is not surprising that historians have often pinned the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy here in the writings of Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer. So we noted before that when the Hamburg Beis Din sent out or was looking for a defense of their positions, they looked across Western Europe and Central Europe. And here, right in the middle here, it is Pressburg, which is where the Chassam Sofer at this point was both rabbi of the congregation. He had also, in 1803, started a yeshiva in Pressburg, which had become the largest yeshiva in Europe at the time. It will be eclipsed later on in the 19th century by the Volozhner yeshiva, but at this point, it is the largest yeshiva in the world. Now, Pressburg is also known by its name Bratislava, and you can see here a picture from the 20th century, right, of the Jewish quarter in Bratislava. The yeshiva was right up here, right up this street. Here are graduates from the Pressburg yeshiva, which continued to have a reputation for excellence right into the 20th century. And so the Chassam Sofer, already in 1819, he had married into what we might call the rabbinic aristocracy. His second wife was the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eger, who who is a member of the older generation, but widely seen probably as the greatest Talmid Chacham in Central Europe at the time. And so he marries his daughter, and he, in 1819, is just beginning to be recognized, right, for his own greatness as a Talmid Chacham. And so over the next several years, right, his language and his writings becomes the focal point for this particular battle. You can see already here in 1819, right, that he too has taken on some of this language, right, suggesting here perhaps that these reformers in Hamburg would come under the category of apikorsin. You can see on your left-hand side. And you can see as well that here, by the end of his tshuva, he has taken on the most difficult of the challenges, right, in this particular text, which was the challenge of davening in any language. right? Most, I believe all of the other tshuvos in this collection, when it comes to the issue of davening in German, davening in another language, they have no choice but to say that, listen, minhag avoseinu biyadenu. Right? We don't change our minhagim. So yes, it may be that there's a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says you can daven in any language, but practically speaking, we don't, and we haven't, and therefore we don't change. Actually, the Chassam Sofer didn't go in that direction when it came to this, and he actually makes a halachic chiluk, right? He between tfilas keva and tfilas akrai, but tefillah that is regular tefillah, and tefillah which is almost spontaneous tefillah, and argues that the Mishnah and the Shulchan Aruch and all the poskim who came before him were all referring only to tefillah sakrai, to a tefillah, to a prayer that was offered spontaneously. That you could do in any language. But the regular tefillahs, like those which appear in the in that we say in shul, that the Shaliach Tzibur says, those, says the Chassam Sofer, were never intended to be said in anything other than Lashon HaKodesh. This is a change. This is the first time we see anything of the sort in the halachic material, and it comes out of a need, right, to define halachic parameters so as to prevent the spread of what the Chassam Sofer saw to be a rather difficult and perhaps existential challenge to the Jewish people. So over this period, 1820 to 1844, as these early Reform synagogues begin to gradually take aim at what I called last time perhaps weaker areas of halacha, the location of the bima, mitzitza b'peh, yom tov sheni, head covering for men, kitnios, kol nidre, right? Things which they believed were taking away, right, from their ability to win acceptance into society, or were taking away from the ability of their service to really to resonate with a younger generation. Each time one of these things came up, they would turn to the Chassam Sofer, amongst others, right, who would pen very, very forceful tshuvos, right, describing why each of these was not acceptable. But what the Chassam Sofer, though, is probably best known for is this particular phrase, which appears in several of his tshuvos, referring to the Reform movement, and it becomes, at least according to historians, this becomes the banner of Ultra-Orthodoxy. If you want to define what is Ultra-Orthodoxy about, you can find it here in the writings of the Chassam Sofer. Hachadash asur min haTorah bechol makom. Anything that is new is forbidden under all circumstances or in all places. Now, the truth of the matter is that historians really, I think, have botched this one quite a bit, because the Chassam Sofer was a far more nuanced and complicated person than they make him out to be. And this phrase itself doesn't quite mean what historians have taken it to mean. And in fact, just by understanding and looking at the first place it ever arises, which is in this tshuva in 1819, you can already see that the Chassam Sofer wasn't quite the extremist that historians sometimes have made him out to be. After all, this tshuva, in which he first writes this phrase, Hechadash asur min haTorah b'chol makom, he is actually writing it in defense of a kula, of a more lenient halachic ruling, not a strict halachic ruling. And the other thing that historians don't recognize is that the Chassam Sofer was a master. He was a master of words. Right? He had all sorts of pithy phrases that were double entendres, right, that she cited from one place and used in a different place because they were memorable and they were powerful. And this is one of them. This is a play on a phrase, right, from the Mishnah. Hachadash asur min haTorah b'chol makom. Chadash, in its original phrase, right, in its original text, is not referring to all things that are new. It's referring to the Isser of Chadash, of eating grain, right, from that year that you haven't waited a full year before consuming. And Chadash, the Mishnah tells us, is Asur. We're not allowed to eat such grain, and it's not just in Eretz Yisrael, it's B'chol Makom. It's in all places. Now, what the Chassam Sofer is doing in this particular tshuva is he is actually defending the lenient practice of Jews outside of Israel who don't abide by Chadash, right, or we should say by Yashan, who don't only eat Yashan flour. If you are in that group, if you will eat at a bakery that isn't only Yashan, you are part of the people that the Chassam Sofer is currently defending. Right? And he says that just like it is hard to uproot a minhag, right? Even in order to be more lenient, right, to be more strict, we also don't uproot our minhagim to be more lenient. And the Chassam Sofer in multiple places will come out quite lenient in a number of areas that actually have to do with modernity, that have to do with shaving, that have to do with modern dress, that have to do with secular studies. He is not what we would consider to be sort of the extreme ultra-Orthodox positions that we might associate with such a community today. The question then becomes, how then is the Chassam Sofer? Why then is he associated by historians as, or called by historians as, the father of orthodoxy? And why did he, and there's no question about it, why did he become the most vocal opponent of these early reformers? And the answer to that question, I think, is two-part. Number one, it has to do with the location of Pressburg. As you can see here, the red border lines here indicate the German lands. And you can see that that Pressburg is actually in a pretty strategic place, placed between kind of the German lands here on the left, and down here, the Empire of Austria. So this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, just as its name suggests, is this amalgamation of East and West. It's Austria, which is culturally German, and it's Hungary, which is culturally East or Slovakian, or identifies more with the Russian lands than with Poland. And the Austro-Hungary at this time brought the two together, and Pressburg is right there on the border between East and West. He's literally, the Chassam Sofer is sitting there in a community, and he knows it. He knows that Pressburg is going to form that bulwark of sort of protecting the East from the encroachment of these reform tendencies in Western Europe into the lands of Hungary, and from Hungary into the lands of Poland and Russia. So on the one hand, he finds himself in this strategic location, but there's another reason why the Chassam Sofer would be so interested in what was happening in Germany, even though he was living in Pressburg. And the key to that is found at the end of every single tshuva that the Chassam Sofer ever wrote. These are the kinds of things that historians like to pay attention to, but when we're learning the Torah of our Gaonim, we generally skip right over them. Right? If you ever get to the end of a tshuva and actually read the signature on a tshuva, you certainly aren't going to take the time to figure out what those Roshei Tevos at the end there actually stand for. Right? But as historians, that's what we do. We actually look for the Roshei Tevos because that's usually where we find the best information. But if the end of every single tshuva signed by the Chassam Sofer has this set of Roshei Tevos here at the end. Right? If we were live here, I'd ask you to give me some guesses as to what it is, right? But to spare you and to spare us the time, I will tell you what this says. This says the Mem Shin Hey Kuf is Moshe Hakatan Sofer. So then that was a rather common way of Baalei Shalos and Shuvos referring to themselves, and so the diminutive Moshe Hakatan, the small Moshe Sofer, and then the next line, Mi Frankfurt de Main. Chassam Sofer is a German. He grew up in Frankfurt. He speaks German. He is deeply connected to the German Jewish community, so much so that in every tshuva he writes, he signs his name as Moshe Sofer, the German. Moshe the Sofer from Frankfurt. He cares about what's happening to German Jewry, right? And he can read everything that is happening in Germany. In fact, he even teaches his own children to read German as well. Right? And so he, unlike many of the other great Gaonim of that time in Central or certainly Eastern Europe, who were completely disconnected from what was happening in Germany, the Chassam Sofer was deeply connected. But the truth of the matter is, it really isn't until his students begin to take positions throughout Central Europe that we really begin to see the makings of an ideology. You begin to see terminology which takes things really a step further in terms of its extremism, in terms of fighting this particular battle. This is a tshuva that comes from Yisrael David Margolios Yafi. It's called Macholas HaMachanayim. And here you can see that the tshuva, the tshuva was put into, it's called She'elas Na'arim. This is a question that comes from the youth of our generation, right? Written here in 1859. And the question, in the question form, it says, and now it is proper for us to make the ways of our Torah as similar as possible to those of the nation in whose midst we reside, because only this way will we find favor in their eyes, right? Isn't it true, says this youth, right, to this rabbi, isn't it true that we need to do whatever we can to make our practice of Judaism as favorable as it can to those around us, so that we will eventually be accepted and be emancipated? And you can see in his response, right, not only does he say no, and that doing anything of this sort, right, is over on this kind of generic isser of lihisdamos, right, dase torasenu uminhagenu, of imitating the non-Jews, but he actually raises the possibility that doing so might constitute yahareg the al yavor. It might actually constitute one of those sins that you have to be killed for rather than actually transgressing. Now, he will ultimately go on and say that actually, in the end, don't worry, because you don't have to let yourself be killed rather than to imitate the ways of the goyim. But the fact that he even entertained the notion, had the havamina, that could be the case, shows us that we're already in a very different space in terms of the strength in which they are responding to this particular challenge. Many of the students of the Chassam Sofer begin to make their way eastward over the next few decades. And one of his students, a man by Rabbi Hillel Lichtenstein, will organize a group of such students or students of the Chassam Sofer, or those who shared the ideology, in a small town called Michalovce. And it is here, more properly, that the beginnings of ultra-Orthodoxy can be found. Because it was in the Psak Din of Michalovce in 1865 that we begin to see, similar to the way we might see it plastered on the walls of Mea Sha'arim or Bnei Brak, very short, to the point, Isurim that are uncompromising in their nature, right, and that are on the full-fledged attack, right, against what is happening, right, in Western Europe. And the Psak Din of Michalovce contains the following Yisurim. It is prohibited to give a drasha on the languages of the nations of the world. And likewise, it is prohibited to listen to a drasha on the languages of the nations of the world. Thus, any Jew who hears a rabbi or anyone else sermonize in a Gentile language must leave the synagogue and go outside. The sermonizer must sermonize in the Jewish language spoken by all kosher Jews of this country. So here we're no longer even talking, right, about even saying tfilos in German. We're talking about a drasha in German. Right? You have to get up and you have to leave should a rabbi do such a thing in your presence. It is prohibited to enter for the purposes of prayer into a shul which does not have a bima in the middle. Again, the Chassam Sofer did write shuvos about why the bima has to be in the middle. It is his students, though, right, who will now argue that it is prohibited to enter into a shul that doesn't have a bima in the middle. It is likewise prohibited to enter a synagogue with a tower. It is prohibited to make clothing for the shliach tzibor and cantors in a way that resembles that of other religions. It is prohibited to make a mechitza which separates men from women in any way which does not completely preclude the men from seeing the women, as it was done in the past. And likewise, if it is already built, one may not enter it. It is prohibited to listen to the tefillos of a choir and a fortiori achas kama v'kama to pray with them or to answer amen after them, even if he is therefore forced to pray alone. Better to daven b'yechidus than to daven in a shul with a choir. This is new. Right? This is not something we've ever found before. It's something which was done in an attempt to defend the halachic system, the integrity of the future of Judaism, but there's no question, right, that it is new. Number 7, it is prohibited to enter synagogues known as chorshuls. Right? And as it says in the Gemara in Shabbos, even if a man is chasing him in order to kill him, or a snake is running to bite him, he should not enter a house of idol worship, and not into houses such as these. And it is prohibited to make a chuppah in a shul. They should only be under the sky. It is prohibited to change any Jewish custom or any manner of the shul which was received from our fathers and our fathers' fathers. Perhaps, though, the most influential text to come out of this time period, the 1860s, was a text called Leva Ivri, written by Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger, who is a Talmud of the son of the Chassam Sofer. And this text takes the ethical will of the Chassam Sofer, something the Chassam Sofer actually wrote for his descendants, and he writes a commentary on it. And it is in this commentary that the Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger reads back into the words of the Chassam Sofer many of their contemporary feelings regarding these changes in Western Europe. And so this is where we begin to see, right, some of the truly extreme articulations of these positions. For instance, know that anything which is done in order to change the customs of Israel, so they should resemble the way in which the Gentiles worship, he transgresses several negative commandments. And it is more severe than eating pig in quality and quantity. It is worse, right, than eating pig to do the things that were listed in the Psak Din of Michalavcha. Right? And here he says, skipping a line, in quality because these negative commandments of resembling the Gentile are an aid to idol worship. And there is a possibility that they might fall into the category of Yiharig, V'al Yavor, whereas the Mecholos HaMachanayim dismissed that possibility, but the Akiva Yosef Schlesinger does not. And again, he does this in the context of a text where he's commenting on the words of the Chassam Sofer. And so this position that following the footsteps of imitating the Gentiles might actually come under the rubric of Yiharig, V'al Yavor now gets connected to the writings of the Chassam Sofer. Okay, I'm going to end in just a minute and we'll take questions. I want to note 2 more important pieces that will lay the groundwork for us for next time. And that is, I noted a moment ago that as we moved from Pressburg, as the students of the Chassam Sofer moved from Pressburg into the Carpathian Mountains, into the eastern side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they do that at about the same time that they begin to take this more radical position, the Psak Din of Michalavcha, ideas of the Yiharig V'al Yavor, those types of things. And if you look closely at some of the towns in here, you begin to notice, right, or understand something about the postcard that I showed you earlier. Perhaps you'll notice this town up here called Munkach, or this town down here called Satmar. These were areas that were enclaves of Hasidus as well. And as the students of the Chassam Sofer who were not Hasidim, but begin to take on positions here in Eastern Hungary, they now form an alliance with some of the Hasidic communities that are there, which is why to this day, communities like Satmar and Munkach are amongst the most extreme, right, on these types of positions of the Hasidic communities. Right? They begin to form an alliance and again a bulwark against encroachment of these German tendencies and reforms into their area, which would explain, right, why our Chassid, right, or our ultra-Orthodox in this picture, right, is referred to as a Chassid, because by the time you get to the interwar period, there had been an intertwining between Hasidim, right, in those areas, Hungarian Hasidim, and the students of the Chassam Sofer. But the one question we haven't yet answered, right, and which will lead us into our next lecture, is the following. We said last time that by the time we got to the 1840s already, we had Reform rabbis who were suggesting things far more radical than a choir in a shul, far more radical than wearing the canonicals or giving a drasha in German. David Einhorn was suggesting that there's no need for halacha at all, that only the Talmud moves in circles. We, however, favor progress. Why was it that in the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s, why was it that these students of the Chassam Sofer, students of the Chassam Sofer, seemed to be fighting a battle that belonged to decades earlier? They seem to be fighting against aesthetic reforms, the earliest innovations of the reformers, not what was actually happening in these reform communities by the time you got to the 1860s, the 1870s. If you recall last time, by 1880, there was already the Treifa banquet. You had reform seminaries that were feeding shrimp to their graduates at their graduation. So why is it that the birth of ultra-Orthodoxy seems to be focused on things that happened decades earlier? And the answer is because Yuval got it wrong. The man in this postcard is not a Reform Jew. The man in this postcard is a neo-Orthodox Jew. And indeed, the birth and the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy were not formed in response to Reform Judaism. They were born, and they were born out of a response to a group of Orthodox Jews who did in fact take some of those early aesthetic reforms of the Reform movement, adopted them, and while keeping their allegiance to Orthodox Judaism. That is the man here on the left, and it is to that story of neo-Orthodoxy that we will turn to next time. Happy to take questions. All right, let me check the chat. Okay. On Isser of Tefillah in language other than Lashon HaKodesh, like Aramaic. Yeah, so that was one of the biggest challenges they had, was how do you get around the fact that we've been davening in Aramaic, right, for quite some time, and there are sources that will suggest that Aramaic is also considered to be Lashon HaKodesh, right, and some will even extend that to Yiddish as well. Okay, how does changing the language of the tefillah reconcile with multiple things in liturgy that are supposed to be said in common language? Okay, good, right? What were some of the halach justifications? Okay, I answered that. Fantastic. Would you agree that part of the problem is that Orthodox Jews are among the planet's most conservative people, resisting any change whatsoever? So, sorry, that was a direct question to me, but I would say that I think I think that's more a symptom, right, rather than a cause. I think that in response to these challenges, yes, they will take on a very, very conservative viewpoint that will apply to everything, to their clothing, right, to the hats that they wear.
I'm suggesting now maybe it's not just cause. It may have been the situation even then.
Okay, perhaps. Do we know if Aaron Chorin was truly a halachic lightweight, or did he have real credentials to back up his tshuva? A good question. I don't, let's put it this way. He was not a lightweight in the sense, you don't become an Av Beis Din of anywhere, right? If you really don't have any, if you don't have any credentials whatsoever. But I will also say he was not really known. He didn't leave us anything substantial in terms of writings outside of these particular areas. And so he certainly was not of the caliber of the types of people who wrote in Eila Divrei Abrius. Okay, did anyone respond to this rightward move after the Chassam Sofer that failing to make accommodations and find leniencies where possible is itself a dramatic change from our tradition? Did anyone respond to this rightward move? Um, no, I would say no, not in Germany. As we'll see next time, the neo-Orthodox are definitely not responding to the rightward shift. If anything, it happens in response. I will say that later on, by the time we get to the advent of the conservative movement, which is which is a breakaway from reform late in the 19th century, but really only comes into its own in the 20th century, you have quite a number of especially in the first half of the 20th century, you have quite a number of very good halachic and Talmudic scholars in the conservative world who will be able to call those things out. Right? They will be able to look at these things and say, wait a minute, this is as new, right, as anything that we're doing. But again, that response will come much later. Were any olive branches extended to the reformers from the traditionalists? At least there should be some common cause with modern day Shivat Zion. No, certainly not in the 19th century. There were none. Not in any significant way. And again, in terms of Shivat Zion, and so the reform movement early on was quite against Shivat Zion because it went against so much of what they were trying to accomplish. You had an arrow pointing to Italy when showing authorities that were consulted. Why was Italy reached out to? There were some well-known rabbis still particularly in northern Italy at the time, and so they were amongst those whose weight would have added to this halacha compilation. Going back to last week, were the changes the reform made effective in reducing anti-Semitism and the greater acceptance by non-Jewish society? So good question. Hard to say. Anti-Semitism, no. I don't think it lowered the bar in terms of anti-Semitism, but so many different things are going to happen over the course of the 19th century. The introduction of Marx and the socialist uprisings, and it's actually Rav Hirsch who will play a very significant role in emancipating the Jews of Western Europe by arguing for a separation of church and state completely for all denominations, not just all denominations, for all religions, that will ultimately bring emancipation to German Jewry in the 1870s. During the decades of reform strengthening, was reform able to show real success in terms of acceptance by the dentists? Okay, same question. So you mentioned that Pressburg had the largest yeshiva. The photo, yes. So those 30 graduates, if you saw the picture, they were I don't know. It was a Teres HaBachurim, something of that sort. They were a special club. That wasn't all the Bachurim in the yeshiva. Those were the best of the best who were being pictured in that question. Was there any equivalent to the reform amongst the Sephardic Jews? That's a great question. The answer is no. And that also explains quite a bit about how the Sephardic community and why the Sephardic community is where it is today. They didn't have either the reform or the response to the reform, right? Which is why in certain ways the Sephardic community is very traditional. In certain ways the Sephardic community, and halachically speaking, has actually been far more flexible, right, or lenient in certain areas that the Ashkenazi community has not been. And obviously in Israel, over the last 70 years, there's been the two have gotten together in important ways. But certainly that was the lack of reform movement in Sephardic countries definitely has an impact on the Jewish communities there. And also related to last week, if reform took hold in those places that tasted freedom and then had it taken away, why did reform really grow deepest roots in the USA where the freedoms were entrenched? So excellent question. Remember that the answer to that question is probably best laid out in terms of who American Jewry was at the time, who was coming to America, right? And the Jews who were coming to America pre-World War II are generally Jews who were already feeling somewhat more distanced from religion. This was known as the Treifa Medina. It was the Golden Medina, and it was the Treifa Medina. Right? It wasn't the place you would come, right, if you had strong ties to your religious observance, and so it worked well for a community that was already somewhat distanced, right, from traditional practice. Now, and remember, when Reform community hits here, it has pretty much severed all ties with halacha. This was now a way for Jews to remain culturally Jewish, right, which is something that was still important to many of them without having to be halachically Jewish. Okay, I think that is it for the questions in the chat. I think the hour is late, but I appreciate you all being here, and I hope to finish the story with you next week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Perl. We appreciate it so much, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week at 8 o'clock.
Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Can't leave.
Good night.
Wait.
Say good night.